Ko koke te monga e ru nei taku nake, ko kai wharawhara te awa e mahia nei aku maharahara, no ingarangi ahau, no tarikaka ahau. E mihi ana ki ngā tohu e nehi o te whanganui atara o no hei nei o, ko Ben Egerton ahau, no reira tēnā koutou katoa. No mai haere mai kia koutou, good evening, lovely to see all of you. There's some friendly faces and some not so friendly faces some of whom I know and who are friendly, and some people that I am looking forward to making friends with later this evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you. I have been teaching all day today. This is the bit I've been looking forward to, like proper talking to people. But I've been teaching all day today, so I'm a bit kind of parched, so forgive me if I splutter. My name is Ben, and I'm deeply honoured to have been invited to give this year's Ramsey Library Public Lecture, hosted by the Anglican Chaplaincy, so my thanks go to the chaplaincy team here at Aotearoa, especially to Matt, who asked me a while back if I'd be interested in speaking about the intersection of education, Christianity and poetry, my three loves. Well, three of my loves. My thanks to Kaitiaki of Ngā Mokopuna, which we heard Mike to tell us a little bit about at the start. So thank you for hosting us this evening. And it's an honour for me to speak in this place. I've done a little bit of teaching upstairs, but it's an honour for me to be down here in this building. It's a first for Aotearoa, it's a first for Wellington, I think a first for New Zealand. This sustainable living building right at the heart of the university, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And I don't want to push the metaphor too hard, particularly as I'm yet to establish that metaphor, but I think it's a wonderfully symbolic place to consider the role of theology, questioning about wonder and spiritual things, and at the heart of education. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about. I need to put this down as I'm going to fiddle with it. I used to be a classroom teacher, and I was forever getting irritated with children, 11-year-olds in my class who were fiddling with things as I was talking, and I'm the worst. So I'm just going to put my hands in my pocket. So that's the topic that I'm speaking on this evening, which I'm hoping you're expecting, because this is why you're here, and you will have seen it on the advertisement. Why education needs theology, and perhaps why theology needs education. I think there are many ways into this topic, and I imagine you've come here this evening bringing some of your own ways with you, perhaps differing ways to me, perhaps differing opinions about the relationship between those two domains, and I look forward to discussing those with you later. Many of you will have heard the story of the little girl drawing a picture at the back of the classroom. The teacher came over and asked her, "What are you drawing?" "I'm drawing God," the girl replied. Surprised, the teacher responded, "But no one knows what God looks like." Without a moment's hesitation, the girl shot back, "Well, they will when I've finished." And I think this story, told by the educationalist Sir Ken Robinson, nicely captures what I'd like to talk about this evening. And that's the role that education needs theology to play. The child approaches mystery through creativity rather than with embarrassment about not knowing or not able to know. Theology and education meet, in this story, in a space between mystery and making. I could come at this topic as an academic. As you heard in the introduction, I'm an academic here at the university. I could come to this as an educator. My day job is Director of Initial Teacher Education. It's a role that I've been involved with one way or another during my last 11 years in tertiary education. Before that, I was a classroom teacher for about 20 years. I know I don't look that old, but I've been in and around education for a long time. Or I could come at this topic as a poet, which I also am. But I'm hoping to come to this as someone who is trying still to make sense of things. I'm still trying to make sense of the world and trying to make sense of my place in it. And as a poet, I pursue my sense-making through the act of making. I'm compelled to do so. And perhaps that's also what academics poets, novelists, including my friend Kate here, who I'm looking forward to hearing speak later. This is what we all share. In one way or another, we are all makers. We are all creators. The poet T.S. Eliot asked, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" If he was grappling with that nearly a century ago, how much more in the digital and in the AI age are we grappling with that now? Education in Aotearoa is sometimes portrayed as a battlefield, a place of a contest. And yes, we're in a policy and educational space which regards itself as secular, where Mātauranga and Kaupapa Māori are being re-erased, where the arts and humanities are under significant pressure, and where education and research funding is increasingly directed towards science, technology, engineering and maths, areas all justified through the language of economic growth. The refreshing of the New Zealand curriculum too now emphasises the knowable, the measurable, the Western. I don't wish for tonight to become a rehearsal of these policy debates, nor an argument against STEM or measurement or economic contribution. Each, of course, has its place. But I do want to ask, what's at stake if these become the dominant narratives? Where in all of this is the wisdom? Where is the sense of connection? And where are the opportunities we are losing in a system privileging the knowable and the measurable? And so I think this is how I want to come at my statement this evening. I'm not here to preach, and I'm not here to argue for the Christianization of education. I'm here because I believe education needs theology, because each of us is inherently creative, just as we were created. And each of us is made with infinite capacity for wonder and for sense-making. I believe education is far from secular. It works in and serves people and communities of all faiths and none, and collides and interacts with belief in all forms. And for me, it's theology which holds open a space for wonder and for creativity that I and many others detect as lacking, diminishing, undervalued, underfunded, perhaps in our education systems and policies towards education, both here in Aotearoa and worldwide. I'm aware, talking about ways in, I'm aware that other ways into this conversation we could discuss include Jesuit education, liberation theology and Freirean pedagogy, values-based education, or engaging in wide debates about spiritual formation. But tonight, I just want to make 3 claims. Firstly, that education needs theology because theology keeps wonder alive. Second, that theology helps us recover creativity as central to being human. And third, that education and theology need one another because both are disciplines of formation and not information. And in doing so, somewhat inevitably, I'll briefly touch on AI and why theology might help us resist the temptation to outsource creativity, wonder, or meaning-making. And I'll conclude by briefly reversing the statement and asking what theology might need from education. Before we dive in, though, as all kind of lectures should, I want to offer a couple of working definitions for education and theology. I want us to remain cognizant of the different arguments around what education is for and why a society educates its citizens. There are economic arguments, there are cultural arguments, there are arguments about political stability and social cohesion, and much more besides. Gert Viesta, some of you may be familiar with that name, for example, describes education as involving qualification, socialisation and subjectification. In other words, the becoming of a person into a unique and responsible individual. Yet, by contrast, New Zealand's tertiary education strategy is strongly orientated towards citizens who, I quote, succeed while contributing to economic growth, productivity and innovation. Isn't that a dishearteningly narrow purpose? But I think it's that word succeed that's up for grabs tonight. Success, I'd argue, is more than economic or productive or something that results in democratic stability. In light of our other term, theology, I propose that success is more about living with an understanding of ourselves as created, as image bearers, as profoundly human in the fullest sense, and crucially with eternal perspective, and with a capacity for wonder about God, ourselves, and the relationships between us. And this is what I sense theology to be. Theology, from theos, the Greek for God, and logos, meaning word or knowledge. To me, theology is permission. It's a space. It's not dogma or a subscription to a fixed set of beliefs or propositions, but it's a conversation, an ongoing attempt at, or an invitation for, making sense of who God is, who we are, and who we are in relationship to him. At its heart, theology is a mode of inquiry comfortable with mystery. What or where is the heart of this university? I'd contend that the spiritual heart is here, on the Marae. It's a place of invitation, of recognition. It's a locus of spirituality. It's a place of the sacred, a place deeply rooted in and in korero with the land, ngā tangata, and with the past, the present, and the future. Administratively, the heart of the university, perhaps, is the Vice-Chancellor's office. Outside the Vice-Chancellor's office are these two pictures. I'm not a great photographer, as you can see. One's straight on and one's slightly aslant. You perhaps recognise these. Some of you may even have been up there to see them. We have Colin McCann's Agnus Dei, Dona Nobis Pacem, whose title is a prayer. Lamb of God, give us peace. One over there. And struggle with my left and right when I have things on the screen, some different orientations in front of me. And Peter Binney's Tabernacle. Tabernacle, of course, being the dwelling place of God in the Old Testament. Unless you've got incredible eyesight, I'll have to read the inscription above the whare's door for you. It says, "The word of the Lord will be preached here." So, in a secular university, are three deeply spiritual, or dare I suggest, theological propositions. The Marae as a spiritual heart, and outside the administrative heart of the university, two exhortations to preach the word of God and a prayer for God's peace. And the third heart of the university, ngā tangata, it's people. People who've hitched their waka to Heringa Waka, meaning the hitching post, from all over the motu, indeed from all over the world. And people of the university bring all manner of experiences and understandings with them. The truly profound happens when all these beliefs and faiths that people bring intersect. Beliefs about everything, and they become in dialogue with each other. And in many ways, secularity at an institutional level protects and promotes these conversations. It creates the conditions for, or even invites these conversations to happen. And perhaps this is the first thing that theology offers something distinctive to education. Education can seem concerned with, or appear reduced to, the acquisition and transmission of information, and then socialising that as knowledge, as facts, as theories, as methods and skills. We've all sat through those kinds of lectures. Some of us might even have been guilty of giving them. Of course, these things matter, and we're all here because we are invested in attaining knowledge to learn something of ourselves and our world, It's what makes us human. Hannah, the mathematician in Tom Stoppard's play Arcadia, would agree. She declares, it's the wanting to know that makes us matter. But theology asks, to borrow one of Canon Mark Oakley's phrases, asks us what that information is doing to us. As I've mentioned before, it's taking education's language of information and turning it into formation. For theology is less interested in answers and more in opening up questions. It points less to knowledge as possession and more to knowledge as pursuit. Theology values the curiosity which drives us to ask questions in the first place, the desire for meaning behind our search for answers. In this sense, theology, an invitation to consider ourselves into relations to that which is beyond us, reminds us that education is not simply the accumulation of information, but the cultivation of people. And it asks not only what do we know, but who are we becoming through what we know? And in doing so, I think theology asks us to reconsider what we mean by knowledge itself. In many contemporary educational conversations, as I've mentioned earlier too, knowledge can be reduced to that which can be measured, tested, verified, or quantified. Theology widens that frame. It reminds us that there are other equally valid ways of knowing. Purako is a way of knowing. Mātauranga is a form of knowing. Experience is a form of knowing. Mapping our internal landscapes is a form of knowing. Art, memory, ritual, faith, all forms of knowing too. All containing and communicating that which cannot be reduced to information, yet remain essential to us, making sense of ourselves, the world around us, the world before us, and beyond us. Perhaps that is why, to quote from Canon Oakley again, God is not the object of our knowledge, but the source of our wonder. Theology, I think, doesn't invite mastery. It doesn't invite an increasing atomization of knowledge. It doesn't only ask us to look in and down. This is valuable, of course, but it also asks us to look up and look out. Theology, again, that call for connection and curiosity, gathers us into wonder at God, at each other, and at a world which exceeds our capacity to fully know it. For knowledge is provisional. It remains until it is tested and perhaps replaced by fresh understandings. But wonder is the constant. Wonder is eternal. Father Richard Rohr, Catholic priest and teacher, said something that stuck with me for a long time. When it isn't a sacred universe, when the whole is not holy, we retreat into our individual silos, our individual importance, and we grasp for significance there. And I wonder if this isn't also an indictment of our organisation of education. We treat policy and the academy and schools treat the deep specialism of knowing and learning, that one subject, their one domain of expertise, as something to be isolated and to be celebrated. And so, again, I'm guilty of this as someone who works here, we slice topics of research into smaller and smaller parts to find some new significance, to make ever more precise units of meaning. Theology, I think, reminds us not to stop slicing. Expertise, of course, isn't a bad thing. Acquisition of knowledge is not inherently wrong, but it asks us to do something else alongside it. Theology asks us to zoom out. It asks us to see the whole and to make sense of the holiness of the whole. It reminds us that our small slice, our little corner, our particular scene belongs within a much larger story. Theology asks Not only what do we know, but also how does what we know connect to everything else? Not that theology knows more than biology, literature, or education, or mātauranga Māori, but that theology asks how these things relate to one another. In other words, theology becomes a discipline of connection. And I would also suggest that it's the discipline of creativity, something I'd urge that needs a fresh valuing or an attention to within educational spaces. George MacDonald, the 19th century Scottish writer, wrote in 1867, "Our imagination is made in the image of the imagination of God." It's a startling idea. Not simply that we have an imagination, but that God has one too. Yes, we can talk about God. This has been organised by the chaplains. And Christians believe that our God-given imagination is fundamental to who we are. So, our capacity to tell stories, paint pictures, write novels and poems, construct an argument, design a research experiment, devise a mathematical formula, to connect and wonder and make meaning is not incidental to being us. It's the defining characteristic of who we are, of our humanness. And Christians recognise Jesus as an example of this. His arguments, his stories, and his teachings were persistently figurative. Jesus made stuff up. His message was imbued with parables and stories and hyperbole and creative language and creative devices to provoke thought and to foster connection. Yet creativity is often pushed to the margins of educational conversations. Or perhaps we fail to recognise creativity when it occurs. And that's Ken Robinson, whose story I mentioned earlier. That's his thesis. His is the most viewed TED. When you finish listening to me, go home, watch Ken Robinson's TED talk about how education kills creativity. It's an interesting watch. I think it's the most viewed TED talk with something like 40 million views. An interesting thesis. I don't know whether I agree with all of it. I'm going off script. I don't know whether I agree with all of it, but it's an interesting proposition that he makes, and makes that connection between education and creativity. Creativity is not opposed to knowledge. It complements it. It makes thinking public. Art does not simply transmit meaning from maker to viewer. Meaning emerges somewhere between the work and the person who encounters it. As Anthony Gormley, the sculptor, suggests, the viewer somehow activates the work when viewing it. And so there is some public meaning-making conversation that can enter in a space that's neither located in the work itself or the people who view it, but it becomes this communal sense of conversation and understanding. I'm currently leading a research project with Kayako exploring how tamariki and rangatahi can surface and share their own pūrākau, their own stories of place. And what interests me in these stories is that they communicate more than knowledge. The tamariki are recreating these stories, these pūrākau, as they carry them. No story, to misquote Heraclitus, can be told in the same way twice. In telling stories, tamariki are not simply recalling or representing information. They are creating the narrative and the narratives again and again as they make sense of themselves and their relationships to the world around them. You do this as well. When you go to parties and you tell your anecdotes, you never say them in this, you embellish them. You figure out who you're, or do I say that bit? No, Mum doesn't need to hear that. You have the story, but its way of telling changes every single time. So I think it's that if imagination is the ability to join the dots, to step back and to see the whole picture and perhaps something beyond it, then creativity is the process of doing something with that imaginative thinking. Creative acts are acts of inquiry. And in stepping back, we make space for those other ways of knowing I mentioned earlier. Mātauranga, pūrākau, story, myth, art, faiths of all sorts, and experience. creativity then becomes a form of re-wondering. Wonder is not passive. It asks for a response. We respond through story, through poetry, through imagination, through acts of making. Each act of creation is knowing afresh, a new encounter with what we think we already know. And theology reminds us that this desire to create and to connect and to make meaning is not an optional extra to human life. It's part of what it means to be human. I'm conscious that I've largely talked kind of in large brushstrokes or in the collective, but I'd like to take a few moments just to locate some of this conversation in my own creative and pedagogical practice, if you'll indulge me talking about myself. As you know, I'm a poet and I'm a teacher, and I don't see those two things as incompatible. I see them as the same vocation. Both, like my Christian faith, are sense-making pursuit, and they are acts of attention. Every time I write a poem, I hope to explore the familiar in a new way, making the familiar strange, as anthropologists, or Shelley likes to say. And every time I teach a subject or concept to my students, I endeavour to do the same. I want it to be new every time for me. And if it's not, it's time to do something else. And if it's not, and if I think I know already everything there is to know about something, whether I'm teaching it or writing to it, then frequently the problem isn't with the subject, it's with me. A failure of attention. And I'm reminded frequently of the poet Mary Oliver's words. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it. As I teach and as I write, those lines remind me to wonder and indeed to pay attention. And theology reminds me to do this too. And when I write, it's seldom with an end in mind. I might begin with a line or an image and allow the poem to discover for itself where it wants to go. Those of us in the room who are writers will understand that very often we are not entirely in control of where the writing takes us. I strive for poems that don't arrive too quickly at answers, and poems that, like theology, hold open a space, that they pay attention, that they show their working, to sit with wonder and allow competing things to talk with one another. And it reminds me that the desire to keep asking questions, to keep creating, and to keep seeking meaning is not simply an intellectual habit. And it's not just what it means to be human, but it means for me to reach up and out for God and to invite God into the details of what I'm trying to make sense of. We are creatures who search. We search for understanding, for belonging, for purpose, for truth, for love. We seek ourselves within stories larger than ourselves. We ask questions which transcend quantifiable answers. We want to know not only how the world works, but what our place is within it. And perhaps that's why education needs theology. Douglas Copeland, who's one of my favourite authors, explores something of this in his collection of short stories, Life After God. And it's a collection haunted by what the sociologist Jürgen Habermas might call an awareness of what's missing. The final story in Life After God concludes with these words. My secret is that I need God, that I am sick and can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give, because I no longer seem to be capable of giving. To help me be kind, as I no longer seem capable of kindness. To help me love, as I seem beyond being able to love. Theology gives permission to consider, perhaps even name, that awareness. And for me, theology informs my creative practice as I ask questions of God and perhaps attempt through poetry to make sense of God, as I put something of myself, my wondering, and the language of that wondering into the world. I did briefly want to touch on AI. Maybe. I didn't want to fall down this particular rabbit hole, but I think no current conversation about creativity, education, and being human seems able to pass without mention of it. AI has roles to play, as many tools do, in the service of creativity, perhaps, and certainly for the search for understanding. But for me, AI's role mustn't be to shortcut or substitute for or to shortcut that substitution or arrival at meaning. That's the resolutely human bit. I'm quite proud of this next line. Theology and technology might share most of the same letters. There's an N and there's a C left over, and I couldn't make it. No, couldn't make that work. Theology and technology might share most of the same letters, but they all have different purposes and mustn't be confused. AI, of course, is an information processing agent and not something we can outsource our wonder or our sense of wonder to. We talk a great deal in education about literacy and numeracy, about developing fluency in language and mathematics. We talk increasingly of digital literacy and technacy, of emotional literacy and physical literacy. But where are the languages of the Spirit? Where do we learn to speak of wonder, transcendence, purpose, vocation, grace, or love? Theology, I believe, needs education because education gives us the language through which we can explore and articulate those deeper dimensions of human experience. Theology needs education to prevent knowledge becoming dogma. Writer Anne Lamott reminds us that the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. Doubt keeps theology asking questions. Certainty tempts theology into believing the conversation is over. Theology needs education because education continually teaches us to question, to test assumptions, and to remain intellectually and spiritually curious. I come back time and again to Mark Oakley's observation that God is not the object of our knowledge, but that source of our wonder. So where to from here? How do we re-wonder education? Of course, there are many things that we can't control, but we can control how we participate. And we can control how we think about where the things we learn and what we know sit within our wider personal and collective concerns. I believe that theology and education can kind of coexist in a pedagogy of wonder, where knowledge and mystery live alongside each other, where open-ended questions are prized, where process is valued as much as the outcome, where experience and embodiment sit alongside empiricism, and where there is space for silence and reflection, where we're comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. Indeed, we deliberately seek it out. For this pedagogy of wonder to work, we must both be students and teachers of wonder, together in a kind of wondrous kahuiako, a community of mutual wondrous learning. Theology-infused education, I think, changes the nature of that conversation. It is the difference between being in conversation with someone because they are trying to persuade you of something. Sometimes when I taught maths, it was like trying to sell something that no one wanted to buy. And being in conversation with someone because they are genuinely interested in you and your ideas. And throughout the conversation this evening, I've not been advocating for the removal of the teaching of the knowledge within early childhood or school or university settings. We can only expand human understandings. We can only make more sense if we know and we understand more. But knowledge is a complement to wonder and creativity, and it must remain so. But knowledge is provisional. We only know something until we know the next thing. As Rachel Held Evans puts it, what gets accepted as evident fact gets rethought and repackaged and challenged. Knowledge is tested, refined, and sometimes replaced. It's an incremental process of unveiling. But questioning, curiosity, wonder, and creativity are the enduring desires that drive knowledge gathering. Theology reminds us of our educative priorities. Not only the knowledge itself, but the habits and actions that lead us towards it. Re-wondering education starts with each of us. Let's not leave a part of ourselves at the door when we enter a classroom or a lecture theatre. Let's not lose sight of what we heard T.S. Eliot ask at the start. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Later in that same poem, it's Choruses from the Rock by T.S. Eliot, Eliot writes, "The soul must quicken to creation." And for me, that means three things. A call to pursue the creative act, to remember that we are part of creation, and to heed the Creator. I want to finish by borrowing two lines. The first is from the English author Frank Cottrell Boyce. He's talking about art, but I'm going to put words in his mouth and make him talk about education. So I think that what he's saying very much applies to our conversation. If education, he says art, I'm saying education, he's now saying education. If education has got one function, it's to point out what's wonderful and say, look, this is your world. And if, as we've explored tonight, we hold education in conversation with theological ways of thinking and ways of asking questions, we begin to give ourselves and our tamariki permission to wonder at our world, to wonder about the past and the present and eternity, and permission to respond, to make sense, to create. The second, and I'll close with this, is from the Welsh poet and priest R.S. Thomas. Poetry, he said, is that which arrives at the intellect by way of the heart. Tonight, I hope that we have begun to consider how theologically infused education does the same. Successful education, to return to that success being up for grabs, successful education perhaps is that which arrives at the intellect by way of the heart. And that which arrives via the heart calls for a heart response, neither measurable, nor quantifiable, nor reductive. The heart, of course, is the locus of love. Education needs theology because it reminds us that education ultimately is an act of love, and that education has a language of love, one that delights in wonder, delights in something for its own sake, and is not simply content to answer questions, but to question answers. Thank you.